Hi, welcome to clip 2 of this week's lecture on colonialism. As I always do, I'll start with trying to convey the kind of core issue, the core idea and the core agenda, the core questions that we're discussing for this week. What's at the heart of this question of colonialism for anthropology? So the core idea here, first of all, I think it's important to clarify that when we say colonialism, there's a slightly different kind of angle to this when compared to the themes of all the previous lectures that we've had on the course. So as you know, each week, as I explained from the very beginning, the idea of this course is to provide you with this kind of rudimentary kind of understanding of core theoretical perspectives and ideas that you need as you go through your kind of trajectory in learning anthropology and social theory more broadly. So each week we've been looking at a kind of particular theoretical position. Now, colonialism is not a word that describes a theoretical position like, say, structuralism or functionalism or whatever it is. It is, of course, a historical condition. It's a historical fact. It's a historical development that lasted for centuries. It doesn't describe, to say that I'm a colonialist is not equivalent to saying that I'm a structuralist. To say I'm a structuralist, say that I adopt a structuralist theoretical perspective in anthropology. To say I'm a colonialist is something that I hope no one is really tempted to say, but it certainly wouldn't mean if I said it that I adopt the theoretical perspective of colonialism as an anthropologist. That doesn't make sense, right? So we're dealing with a different kind of topic this week, is the point that I'm making. We're dealing with ways in which the historical condition and development of colonialism and post-colonialism sits in relation to the project of anthropology, and the ways in which theories and perspectives and crucially critiques that were developed as part of understanding the condition of colonialism and post-colonialism within anthropology, sure, but also beyond anthropology, as we'll see. There's a whole field called post-colonial studies. So how these perspectives have impinged, shifted, critiqued, confronted anthropology with very serious challenges since the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, and all up until today. And of course, the question of decolonial anthropology, whether it's possible, what it might look like, the whole question of anti-racism, these are all, of course, intimately connected with the topic of colonialism, obviously. So this week and next week, in a sense, are coupled up in looking at these issues from a variety of angles, right? So what's the core concern? What's the core idea when we think about colonialism in anthropology? Well, it's fundamentally this realization that anthropologists' objects of study, the people that anthropologists study, so often need to be understood in relation to their post-colonial condition, or their colonial condition if we're looking at anthropology historically. Now, interestingly, note that anthropology kind of spans historically a period of high colonialism, which is when anthropology is actually born as a discipline, very much as part, as we saw in the first weeks, the development of evolutionist models, which were basically forms of scientific racism in the 19th century, and all the way until roughly the Second World War and thereafter, actually quite a few decades after in some cases. Anthropology is conducted under conditions of colonialism. And then from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s onwards, as more and more colonies gain their independence, often through revolutionary movements across different parts of the world, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, in Oceania, and so on, anthropology begins to be conducted in conditions of what's called post-colonialism. Many people would also talk about conditions of neo-colonialism, and we'll look at that also in today's lecture, the ways in which structures of colonialism have outlasted the institution of colonialism itself and actually continue to form the condition in which such activities as anthropology continue to be conducted. So the people that anthropologists understand need to be understood in relation to this condition, or at least many of them. I say that because, as you know, in recent decades, partly as a result of the kind of post-colonial critiques of anthropology, a lot of anthropology has been conducted in parts of the world that were colonizers. So there's anthropology, for example, of contemporary UK, contemporary United States, contemporary Denmark, contemporary Holland, contemporary Portugal, contemporary Spain, contemporary France, contemporary Belgium. These are all colonial powers from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, 20th century. These are all countries that are involved in colonial activity. Australia. So there's a lot of anthropology done in these countries. So that's not to say that the condition of colonialism is not relevant, of course, partly because these countries are characteristically populated by many migrant populations that arrived in these countries as part of the story of colonialism and post-colonialism. And that's, of course, the case in Britain today, as much as it is in all other colonial countries. But still, many of the studies that anthropologists conduct are conducted in countries that were subject to colonialism, and taking that into account, and crucially taking also into account the fact that anthropology was itself part of this picture, is what we're talking about this week, right? So there are three related aspects to this that I want to cover in today's lecture. So the first sense in which colonialism impinges on anthropology, or relates to anthropology, if you like, is, as I say, that its objects of study, the people that anthropologists have studied, have been colonial or post-colonial subjects. And that means that anthropology, by that very fact, has in the past decades been part of, in complex and not often free of tension ways, with broader conversations in social theory, social sciences, history, about the post-colonial, the colonial and the post-colonial condition. So a body of literature that has grown, and which we'll look at, and which you are reading some of for this week, that has come to be tagged as post-colonial studies. So there's that relationship in trying to understand the colonial condition, the post-colonial condition of the people that we are seeking to engage with as anthropologists. We need to also engage with these debates, that literature. A second aspect of the topic this week is, of course, that, as I've already said, anthropologists themselves operate within the framework that colonial history has established, right? They are themselves, have been, and continue to be, and that's crucial, I think, to not shy away from understanding, part of this picture. There have been players within the kind of socio-political field of colonialism. And we already have begun to broach this question last week when we talked about the crisis of representation in the 1980s anthropology, and this call to reflexivity. And what was that call to reflexivity? It was a call, among other things, to take into account the inequities and inequalities and asymmetries of the relationship between the anthropologist and the people that they study, precisely because of this conditioning that the development of colonialism and post-colonialism, of which anthropology is part, provides or creates, right? So we're talking about the requirement for reflexivity, but also a kind of active realignment of anthropology in relation, for example, to history, because colonial dynamics, of course, developed historically. So anthropologists cannot ignore the history of their own discipline, just as they can't ignore the history of the people whom they study, according to this perspective. And then finally, there's an idea that kind of follows on from that, which is the question of how far actually anthropology as an activity, inherently, the kind of intellectual activity of doing anthropology, is itself, in some senses, inherently colonial. There's a question mark to that. It's a question that one has to debate in the light of these concerns, right? And for many, the answer to that question is yes, anthropology is indeed inherently colonial. And then the question is, what does one do about that? Should one abandon the discipline? Or how might one go about reforming the discipline of anthropology in a way that addresses this concern, right? So these are the three kind of areas that we're going to be covering in today's lecture. So the core agenda that we're looking at here fundamentally springs when we're looking at kind of anti-colonial approaches that develop in the light of these engagement with post-colonial theory within anthropology, is a tendency to want to advance a kind of radical critique of all forms of what is often known in anthropology as essentialism. So the idea, for example, that has been so central to the development of the history of anthropology, and which we have examined in the development of these lectures, that the world is imagined as consisting of these identifiable wholes that are called cultures or societies, or even structures, if you think of Levi-Strauss in some sense. In some senses, I mean, I don't want to get caught up in the detail there. But anyway, this idea that, for example, we can talk about the culture of the Arawete people in Amazonia, or the society of the Nuer, the social structure of the Ashanti, etc. These kinds of ways of thinking in anthropology, which was so dominant for so much of the discipline's development, right? This identification of almost like kind of geopolitical territories that are then studied by the anthropologist as such, these territorial whole cultural social units, right? And that somehow there's something distinctively and essential to those units that the anthropologist needs to understand. That comes up for radical critique when you take into account the inherently colonial conditions that formulate these supposed cultural and social wholes as such, right? You cannot get away if you're informed by the understanding of colonialism with treating the Nuer, famously studied by Evans Pritchard in the 1930s, as a kind of social whole that needs to be understood in its own terms, because the Nuer, the way that the Nuer live, is completely imbricated and embedded in colonial dynamics. And the very fact that someone like Evans Pritchard can go and study them in the first place is itself an expression of those colonial dynamics, right? So this critique of essentialism is central to this, to the agenda that we're looking at this week, right? So the people that anthropologists study are as they are because they're embedded in these unequal relationships within those structures of power that produced anthropology as well, and in which the anthropologist is also embedded. So we need to look at the people that we're studying as a function of being embedded in these relationships of which we ourselves participate, in which we ourselves participate. So anthropology, according to this approach that does not start with and focus on the colonial condition, is itself a colonial anthropology. To ignore this and to continue as if it didn't exist is precisely to support in your complacency, perhaps, those very colonial structures that shoot through the discipline of anthropology. So anthropology, therefore, if it's not to fall into that trap, has to draw on post-colonial studies as well as history and political economy and other disciplines in order to be able to describe and account for the post-colonial condition and subjectivity. We'll see that this question of subjectivity is particularly important as well. The way that the condition of colonialism creates particular kinds of subjects. Think of Foucault here, very relevant. That needs to be taken into account by anthropology as well. And finally, just to cover the broad picture, anthropology, in doing this, does not only need to be reflexive, it certainly needs to be reflexive, as we saw last week, but that's not enough. It needs to develop radically self-critical and actively anti-colonial and anti-racist fields of study, methodologies, theoretical approaches, ways of going about doing the very activities, for example, of fieldwork that anthropologists conduct. All of that needs radically to be rethought in the light of these insights about the inherently colonial dynamics of the activity of anthropology. So that's the kind of, broadly speaking, the agenda that we're looking at. So finally, for this clip, what are the kind of core questions that an anthropology that engages with this question of colonialism and post-colonialism might pose? What has the role of anthropology been in relation to colonialism? A central question. In what ways do similar structures continue today? This question of neo-colonialism, right? So very often one of the ways in which anthropology has sought to bypass some of the challenges that post-colonial studies has posed to it is to say that these are issues of the past. We've somehow, through the reflexive turn of the 1980s, overcome them. We're aware of these issues and so on. So now we can continue to conduct the business of anthropology that we find so interesting and so on. But that, of course, is radically to be questioned if you take into account the ways in which the structures that we ascribe to the colonial conditions have in no way disappeared. And in fact, the continuation of anthropology might itself be an expression, according to this perspective, certainly, of the continuation of neo-colonial activity in this way. How might anthropological models and approaches need to be reformed, reconstituted, in order not to gloss over the post-colonial condition of the people that anthropologists engage with and study, right? What do we need to do to anthropology to rise to this challenge? How might anthropology actively contribute to understanding the condition of coloniality and post-coloniality? How far is the activity of anthropology itself an example of colonial dynamics? I've already mentioned. And what might an anti-colonial anthropology look like? Is it even possible? Now, you might remember that we put these issues on the table from the very first week of this course when we looked at that article by Jobson, a very recent article, which argues effectively that if anthropology doesn't align itself with an anti-colonial, anti-racist struggle, it isn't worth continuing as a project. It should be allowed to burn, right? In this very evocative image that Jobson uses in relation to the fires that were raging at the time when he was inspired to write that article in America. So, that's how far this argument can go. And as we'll see this week, and as you'll have seen in reading, for example, Edward Said's article that I set as one of the core readings for this week, some of the arguments that have been made have been precisely that anthropology, at least in the ways that it's been understood throughout its development in the 19th and 20th century, simply needs to be scrapped, right? If you're anti-colonial and you think anthropology is inherently colonial, well, then you should just stop doing anthropology. So that's a very strong position that forms part of the kind of very, very pointed debates that take place around these questions since the 1970s and up until today, and which we'll carry on looking at in the following clips for this week. So see you in the next clip.